And we'll do this every session. So we'll probably stop the recording before the Q&A at the end. So you can feel free to ask your questions without having them be recorded and placed online. So we'll get started. Basically, we decided that we wanted to do a brown bag over the summer for a chance for us to get together to explore some of the practical implications of what it means to redesign our courses for fall, and to share ideas that will encourage us to spur one another on. This task that we're being asked to do for fall is monumentous, and as a result of that, we need each other. Plus, it's just so lovely to see all of you together in one space. So hopefully you will find encouragement from this as well. We are going to do a weekly brown bag. Each Monday you can join us from 1 to 2 p.m. We'll have a very short presentation, some Q&A, and then breakout rooms for discussion. We're going to hit on topics like designing your course, organizing your course, how to handle assessment, some technology tools that might be useful, how to do groups effectively. This was one thing we learned from the faculty and student surveys. Us as faculty said we loved group work. Our students said, whoa, when we moved online, group work was a really difficult thing for us. So we're gonna help bridge the gap, give us some tools that can set us up to be really successful in using groups and teams. As we move into fall, talk about community building, and then using this very strange socially distant classroom that we will have before us in the fall for some face-to-face time. Our goals and objectives today are for you to be able to walk away being able to tell the difference between face-to-face learning, online learning, and this new beast called modified face-to-face learning, and that you'll be able to describe how this new approach to learning applies to your teaching, and recognize the design changes that are going to be required in your courses for this modified face-to-face learning, and then see us as faculty development and meet the academic development team that's here to help and support you along the way. So what is this term modified face-to-face learning that we've just learned about a week or so ago in Julie's email? This graphic is complex, and I'm not going to expect that we walk through it all right now, but rather I want to situate modified face-to-face learning on a continuum of things that we're more familiar with. So we're very familiar with traditional face-to-face learning, and on the other end of the continuum, some of us have a greater or lesser degree of familiarity with online learning. And what we're being asked to do for fall is called modified face-to-face learning, and it's kind of situated with one foot in both of these learning environments. So we'll talk through this so that you can gain some clarity over what it is modified face-to-face teaching and learning really is. Let's start by thinking about our lovely Bethel classrooms, which we all miss so dearly. Our traditional face-to-face experiences are that they are face-to-face, they're highly collaborative, they're student-centered, and they embrace all of the hallmarks of what a Bethel education really is. As colleagues, we are excellent at this in all the various ways that we do it. In all the classroom spaces that we have, this is where our training really has come to bear lots and lots of fruit for our students. And the thing that I think, I speak for myself, but probably for a lot of you, that we're really sad to not have in front of us right now. And the face-to-face experience that we will have in the fall is unfortunately going to look very different than the images that we're familiar with at Bethel. Most of us use Moodle in this face-to-face environment as a place to place materials, to direct students, but we use it to greater or lesser degrees because most of the content and even some of the submission of assignments takes place in this face-to-face classroom. On the other end of the continuum, we have online learning, and some of us have a greater or lesser degree of familiarity with online learning. At the undergraduate level at Bethel, we offer just a handful of fully online courses, and these are generally, not always, but generally asynchronous in terms of their delivery mode and content. And you often have the role of the professor kind of parsed into different categories. You have an instructional designer that helps you create the Moodle site, you bring the content, and then in some cases you're the instructor, in some cases you're not. And so this raises for faculty in the past some questions related to intellectual property and ownership of these online courses. And Bethel's made some really good strides here in moving to having faculty own a lot of their intellectual property for CAPS, GS, and SEM. But this is kind of a fully online course that either you could teach or someone else could use your framework and teach from. If you have in your head some of the advertisements that you've seen, like you could take a class at Harvard or you could take a class at Yale from a very famous professor, sign in, you'll be a part of the course, but it's rare that you'd actually interact with that faculty member in any sort of way. That's kind of what you should put in your mind for the other end of the spectrum as a fully online learning experience. Of course, there are variations to that, but that helps you root yourself on both ends of the spectrum. So modified face-to-face learning falls in the middle. And it really is a strategic design of your course that allows you to move really seamlessly between a virtual learning environment and a face-to-face environment. And that honestly is the situation that we are in. Some of you may have heard this type of learning be referred to before as remote learning. It's functionally designing a course for a remote learning setting, and then we have the honor of having our students face-to-face at some points during the semester. That's functionally what it is we're being asked to do. We need to design our courses for a remote learning environment that has a face-to-face component. Now, we are all used to designing our courses for a face-to-face environment, and in some cases, we have a remote component to that. You may have a student submit an assignment or two on Moodle or use Google Documents to collaborate, but we're really, really used to designing for that face-to-face format. This modified face-to-face teaching and learning environment flips this on its end and asks us to design for this remote environment where we happen to have a face-to-face component sprinkled in. Now, the challenge with that face-to-face component is that it's not going to look the same for every student. We'll talk about that in just a second. So we have to keep that in mind as we're thinking about designing for remote learning. So I want to pause here for a minute and have you just reflect on, can you put together a definition of modified face-to-face learning? How would you describe it? And how is it similar to or different from the face-to-face or online learning that you might be more or less familiar with? Just take a couple moments to pause and reflect over these on your own. And if questions arise, jot them down. You can either put them in the chat now, or we can hold on to them and we'll answer them after a little bit more conversation. And Christine, before we jump forward, is there anything that you would like to add to this earlier conversation?
I think this looks great. Let's just keep moving and we'll answer things as we go.
So now we understand a little bit about what modified face-to-face learning is. It's really building a remote learning course, so a course that's really housed in an online environment, and it's something that's accessible to all students, whether they're face-to-face in the classroom or they're virtually in your classroom. And the key to creating a modified face-to-face learning environment is to keep ourselves centered on our students. So I have 3 questions for us. They come from a great article, which I'll provide in the link here at the bottom of the presentation when it's available for you after the session. You can visit the article. It's got some great details in it. But we want to think about interactions. So there are 3 key sets of interactions to keep in mind when designing our modified face-to-face learning experience. And the first is, how are our students going to interact with the content? So this involves thinking about, again, what the learning outcomes are that we already have for our courses and deciding if they need to be modified in any way to fit with this new remote learning approach. And then also thinking about what our students will do with the content that they are accessing in a synchronous or asynchronous way. So what will they do beyond reading, watching, or listening to something? How will they engage with that particular content? And then we want to ask, how will our students interact with each other? So how will students meaningfully contribute to the classroom environment? How will they work together in such a way that they feel like they're a part of the learning community? They're generating information, knowledge, and understanding with one another. So thinking very strategically and planning very strategically for intentional interactions between students with the content and with each other will be integral to designing this new learning experience. And then how will our students interact with us as instructors? So how can we guide our students and be flexible for their learning needs and accommodating given the uncertainty of the fall without burning ourselves out, right? We can't design for 4 or 5 different scenarios. We can't run 3 different versions of our course. We need to design one course that will be flexible enough to meet the needs of ourselves and our students in that learning environment. So if we think in terms of interactions, how they interact with the content, how they'll interact with each other, and how they'll interact with us, that can give us some good starting points for launching into a design process to create this remote course with a face-to-face component. And you don't need to do this by yourself. So we have a great team, and I know there's some confusion around who's available to help because we just went through a large restructure, and the TLT we all had on speed dial and in our emails, right, is not in existence anymore. But we have an amazing team in the academic development team. Jody is here today. She's one of several instructional designers on that team, and they have put together some really awesome resources, which I'll have her share with you about in just a moment. And then our faculty development team is here for you too. We're going to, like I said, be doing these weekly brown bag lunches, but be available for conversation as you are designing these courses for fall. So Jody, if you're okay, I'll toss it over to you and you can tell us a little bit about the Flex Design course, the workshops, and the appointments that your team is offering.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so some of you in here already have been working a bit in the Flex Design course that we have on Moodle. If you haven't been in there yet and would like to be, probably the easiest way to access it is if you've got Julie's email from last week. She had a link right in there. If not, I can add it in a little bit. But all you have to do is request access and everybody will get access to this Moodle site. And what it is it's really broken up into 3 different sections, kind of the way we think about teaching a course. And it's kind of the initial planning for it, just the draft piece of it. And then there's a section that's on adding details and how can we do that? What do those look like? How can we do that well for all students? And then the 3rd section is the kind of more tangible pieces about building a syllabus and building a course site and using Moodle to be able to do that. So this Flex Design Moodle site that we set up has several things that are very helpful for CAS, but it's also set up for people in CAPS and SEM and GS. So my only caveat is that there are lots and lots of resources on there for you. Don't feel like you need to read and watch and implement every single thing on that site. What we did is we said, we're not going to try and judge and predetermine who needs what. We're going to say we've got great information and a lot of things cross over schools. Some of you who teach in CAS and in CAPS or in GS see some of those things. So it's all out there for you. Use it. We want you to use it to ask questions, but also know that if you see something on there that you're like, this makes no sense to me, that's okay. If you don't want to use the audit that's on there, you don't need to. But there's an audit on there, for example, that you could look at. We also have 3 different workshops, actually now 4 different workshops that we are running that go really well with this Flex Design site that we have. The first one kind of takes a look at that draft that you have. One of the things you'll hear on that site is that we use the term course plan a lot of times. And for those of you who have built courses with an instructional designer, that's very familiar language to you. A course plan is really just a way that we look at the information we have that's going into a course. We have a blank course plan on there. It's basically a worksheet. Feel free to use it if you want to. If not, it doesn't mean you don't need, or you won't find value in the site or in coming to one of our workshops. We've had a lot of people come to the first workshop. That's kind of that draft mode, saying like, hey, where do I start? Here's all of the information I need to cover over the semester, and I just don't even know where to start with it. So that first workshop, emphasis is also on work. They're 2 hours long. We have everything on the site so that it is kind of like what some of our students are going to experience this fall. All of the information is available to them on the Moodle site. There's not new learning necessarily at the workshop, but there's instructional designers and expert consultants at the workshops with some more guided conversations and then some very specific work time. So one of the things we did this last week is we looked at scaffolding activities, and we actually had a wonderful conversation, not just about scaffolding activities, but what does it look like for freshmen coming in this year, and scaffolding, how they're supposed to connect with each other, and how can we build that into a site. So workshops are 2 hours set aside. We've got some guided conversation in there, but also plenty of work time. You can turn your volume down and just know there's instructional designers there to help. The second workshop is looking at more of those details. And Molly Noble comes into that workshop, and she helps kind of represent the media design that we can do and that we can help with. And then the third workshop we have is really looking at some of those details in building a syllabus. And with that, some of the pieces that can be really helpful to look at with building a syllabus and how to make sure it's accessible online. And that even means having it written so that a screen reader could easily be able to read it for one of your students if that's something that you're going to need to have done. And then we just also have Justin Acree, who is now our instructional technologist. So TLT is no more, but we have Justin from ITS Help Desk, who now has taken this position as instructional technologist. So he's there to help with all the Moodle pieces and building things well in Moodle. And really the goal is to not overwhelm instructors so that students can have a good experience. The goal is to really just look at everything and just build it well so we all can survive. And so our fall doesn't feel like spring did, where everything is just up in the air constantly, but just to really take a look at things and build it so it's all set to go, it works smoothly. And then finally, we have one-on-one appointments. So that also in the email that Julie sent out, there's links for that, but we have that for the instructional designers. We each have 6 appointments every week that are consultation appointments. I had one this morning with CAS faculty, and it's where you can just sit down and say, I have no idea what this would look like in an online environment. Here's what happened face-to-face. And we can put our heads together and come up with something that hopefully at the end can make you feel like, wow, never thought of it that way, but I think we can all feel satisfied, and that students, at the end of the day, students are getting what they need to be able to get, and we aren't dying in the process because we're overwhelmed and trying to do more and more and more with less and less, or at least what sometimes feels like less and less. So that's it. And then the fourth workshop that we added is that Molly Noble also added one that is specific to designing media for your courses and what that looks like and what some of kind of the best practices are with that. And I know that's kind of a pretty big piece for CAS when you're making that change from face-to-face and students sitting and watching you and figuring out what that needs to look like in an online or a modified face-to-face environment. So we're in it together, right, Sarah?
Yes, thank you so much, Jody. Your team has been a great help. If you have not sent out and filled out the registration for the Moodle Flex Design course, we'll make sure that that link gets to you. I love that buffet of choices. Many of you have some experience dabbling with online courses, whether you took one or whether you have taught one, but that course is awesome because you can self-serve. You can actually choose the topics that you need as you're working on them. There's a lot of pre-recorded videos available, and their best practices are right there. And so that's a resource that I would make sure you have access to as soon as possible. Thanks, Jody. So there's some questions that were floating around in the chat that we'll talk about in a little bit. And one of those is if you indicated you were interested in teaching in a fully online environment and haven't heard back yet. Academic Affairs, I confirmed with Julie this morning, is still in the process of working that out. And they hope to be communicating that soon, because ultimately that does influence your course design. However, since we're all preparing for remote course design, you should feel free to get started in that, because we're all going to be building our courses for an online platform. And it's just that some of us will have the capacity to have a physical classroom with social distancing in place. This obviously looks really different than the teaching that we are used to doing. Our students will be seated 6 feet apart. There will be masks, and there will not be sharing of materials. And so there's been a group of faculty who have started brainstorming ways to use that space. Some people have said they're going to be thinking about it as office hours, where students can come in and get questions answered. Other people have indicated maybe using this as a case study time for the students. Some faculty have said, well, I'm going to use this for what's called just-in-time teaching, where you can come in and clarify the points with your students that you're seeing are really muddy, they're really struggling to understand, kind of do a little mini teaching experience to kind of help get them back on track. We have 240 some acres of outdoor learning space. And as we know, when you're outside, you are able to have more people together. So it's possible that we utilize our outdoor classroom spaces as possible, obviously weather permitting, unless we're really hardy in November, we will all be inside. But you could think about if you want to use that classroom space as well. And other people have talked about the realization that the classrooms that we're going to be teaching in are likely not to hold all of our students at the exact same time. So maybe a third of your class will fit in your classroom at any point in time, given the new social distancing parameters. Maybe half of your class will fit in your classroom during your regularly scheduled class time. And so given that information, some faculty have tossed out the idea of teaching one face-to-face class each week, and you're just doing it 3 times or 2 times, once on Tuesday, once on Thursday for half of your students. And there'll be some resources available to you later on about how to use Zoom to set up your laptop in front of you and record that session for any content delivery that you're doing. You're not being asked to record the discussions among your students, should you be using that time for discussion. But there may be ways to get the content from that discussion to be available to all of your students. So we have a lot of creative thinking that we can harness amongst our colleagues for thinking about how to use this face-to-face space that we have. But the largest thing that I want all of us to hear today is just that we really have to design for a remote setting. These physical face-to-face classrooms are kind of icing on our cake for us, but our course has to be remote for fall. And that's because we're going to have students in our classroom that are going to get sick, and they're going to come in and out of our learning environment. We might get sick, which means we have to be able to come in and out of our learning environment as well. And it's possible that we may have a student in our class that's has an underlying health condition, and they may not actually be on campus with us, but they will be enrolled in our course. And so out of equity for reaching instruction for all of those students, we will need to have a fully remote course. It also gives us and leverages for us the ability to pivot online at any point in the semester. That could be after Thanksgiving, it could be in October, but it sets us up to not go through what we did in the spring, which was a crash and burn, to try to get everything online by designing in advance for a remote classroom setting. So Christine and I want to give you just a couple of examples to start your thinking about ways you could maybe conceptualize your course design. Christine's going to share a class day design, so thinking at the level of a day of class, and I'm going to share a weekly design, so thinking about your course at the scale of a week. So Christine, I'll let you start with your class day example.
Sure, that sounds good. There is a little bit of weekly design, also built into this, so I will do a both and here. When I'm thinking about designing for remote learning, I am structuring every single class period in a very specific way. So that way, if I have students sitting in the room with me for the first 3 weeks, and then everybody has to go for sure online or can't be in the class, we can have the exact same class structure. Here's what I'm doing. All students will be watching prior to the week starting what is called a core lesson. It is delivered in an asynchronous fashion. I have pre-recorded it. It is a narrated PowerPoint on steroids. Students will have watched that information. They will have watched supplemental materials as well as reading materials. When they come to class, the first 30 minutes of class will be myself and or my other instructors in well-being providing facilitated discussion, activities, whatnot. And then the second 30 minutes is going to be student interaction. One of the key hallmarks of well-being is that we have students work in small groups all semester long to continue to work on their dialogue skills. And in order to keep that going, we are very specifically going to have 30 minutes of faculty facilitated, 30 minutes of student discussion in their huddles. And here's why. Let's say weeks 1 through 3, we can all be in the classroom together. Somehow we get a big enough classroom to do this. And we get in the rhythm. For the first 30 minutes, I'm teaching, I'm facilitating things. Then we transition into dialogue amongst the students in their small groups. And at week 4, we realize we can't be together for whatever reason. What will happen is I will then do the first 30 minutes of class time in recorded pieces that I will send out for the students to complete asynchronously. And then we will meet together as a class via Zoom in a synchronous fashion where the dialogue among students can continue to happen in the smaller breakout rooms that Zoom provides. So therefore, it doesn't matter to me whether I am literally physically in the class with the students or I am teaching fully remote. We are establishing the exact same course rhythm. The only thing that will be different about it is whether or not it's fully facilitated via Zoom or it is facilitated in the physical classroom space. Our transition will be very seamless. Now, that does mean, though, that I need to be prepared to get across my 30 minutes of if I was going to be teaching it verbally or having students interact with one another during those first 30 minutes. I may need to get to the point where I have my students experience pre-recorded information halfway through the semester, the beginning of the semester, whenever I want to move to that. So for me, my days are going to look exactly the same, whether I'm in the classroom with the students or not. It's just the, whether it's physical classroom space or Zoom classroom space that will facilitate this. Here's a reason why I am choosing to do the first 30 minutes if I have to be 100% remote this semester because we have a COVID flare-up. If I am going to do those first 30 minutes in an asynchronous fashion, I have some reasoning for that. This year, we have found out that there's several students that had a very challenging time actually being able to get online at the exact same time as all of their peers and sustain the Wi-Fi connection in their households for a full 60 minutes, a full 90 minutes of class time. Therefore, if I am going to move completely remotely, I can't ever have anybody in the classroom. I want to make sure that my synchronous class times via Zoom are very strategic and limited, and they're very interaction based amongst students. I'm not going to waste, for me personally, my synchronous class time on talking head stuff or content delivery. I can do a lot of that and distribute it to the students and have them learn the content without having to waste my synchronous class time. So for me, that's how I'm designing my class times. I'm doing a lot of preloading so that all the students come in with the same content, but then strategically designing my course to be able to go back and forth if need be. Sarah, did I make that clear, or was that clear as mud?
Clear as mud, right? Now, Christine, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing how you're thinking about your time in 30-minute increments of instructor facilitated versus student working and collaboration time. My model looks a little bit different because I'm thinking on the scale of a week. And I'm hopeful that this might spur some thinking for you all. I teach a Monday, Wednesday, Friday mod schedule. And then my intention is to think about establishing a rhythm, much like Christine, when we start face-to-face, that Mondays is going to be a little bit more content delivery. So my goal here is to get students to understand the basic conceptual principles that we'll be working with for the week. If you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy for learning, my aim here is Bloom's levels 1, 2, and maybe a little bit of 3 for the content. So if we're face-to-face, and if I can get my whole classroom in one space at one time, then I'll use this much like a typical face-to-face class session, more lecture driven, where I have my students together. If I can't be in the same space with them at the same time, then this will become asynchronous with some check-ins and some quizzes along the way. On Wednesdays, we are going to have our synchronous time together. So whether we're face-to-face or whether we're online, this is going to be the time where we're going to check in, and I'm going to spur my students' thinking on to the upper levels of Bloom's. So to the analysis, synthesis, application levels, evaluation levels of thinking. So I'll be providing some context for them delivered, and then we're going to start discussing and talking about how we apply our concepts to problem solving and case studies and real world scenarios. And then on Friday, my intention is to have my students meet together in groups. So they will be in a regular pattern of meeting together. They'll be working with the same students all semester long, and they're going to be problem solving and applying the content in groups on Fridays. So we'll kind of have a weekly rhythm. They'll do some asynchronous content on Monday. We'll have our synchronous time together on Wednesday, kind of transitioning them from lower order Bloom's thinking to higher order Bloom's thinking. And then Friday will be this collaborative group time. Now, because I have a mod schedule, I can tell them reserve that time frame to meet with your groups, and if we're face-to-face, they'll be able to do that regardless of location. If we're off campus, because students have been sent home, they'll still have that space in theory reserved, but it doesn't preclude a group from deciding that they want to meet at 9 o'clock at night. Their team can set up an additional or different meeting time that better suits their needs if they're in an off-campus setting. So just a couple of ideas to get your thinking started about kind of thinking at the day level, the week level, as you start to envision what a modified face-to-face environment might look like for you. So we have time now for questions and conversations. If you haven't been in a Zoom session before, there's a couple of ways you can use the chat feature. Some of you have found it already and ask questions. Please type in your questions there. We can answer them specifically. But you can also, if you see a colleague from your department or someone you know in the Zoom chat, you can actually initiate a conversation directly with that person. So if you have an idea about something something you want to talk about in English and you see somebody else here from your department, you know, feel free to reach out to them and initiate a chat that way. That's private, and so none of the hosts will see that conversation. So with that,
Sara, if I could just jump in real quick, I'm going to pause recording just so everybody knows that right now too. I'll stop recording, so feel free to ask questions and no, we're not going to record those.